people of all creeds and political stripes and races and what have you to fight over Martin Luther King's legacy. You saw, for example, a lot of Black conservatives posting all kinds of memes today. Martin Luther King was a good man. He did a lot of good things. Thank you, Martin Luther King. Happy Martin Luther King Day, whatever, whatever. And then still you see some of them even going so far as to say Martin Luther King will be rolling over in his grave if he saw the social justice woke Black Lives Matter and all these organizations that exist today. I disagree. I think he would be cheering them on, if not part of these organizations like Black Lives Matter. And I say that because he was doing the very same thing in his day. The the version of Martin Luther King that is accepted by many today is the one that was pushed and peddled by the mainstream media at the time, and then throughout the 70s and 80s. That is far removed from the reality of who he was and what he actually was doing and was trying to do. The I Have a Dream speech wasn't even written by him. It was written by Clarence B. Jones, Stanley Levison, and Bayard Rustin, all of whom were communists. So to the question of, well, why
Is
would
that real quick?
communists?
I don't want to, but is that all verifiable? Like if people look that
Yeah,
up,
it's
they could see it.
verifiable. Yeah,
Okay,
Clarence
continue.
Clarence B. Jones, who's still alive right now. Like there's numerous interviews that you can look up where he's telling you who wrote the speech or who had a hand in writing the speech.
I got you. So those are
Uh,
ghostwriters. Yep. Go ahead.
yeah,
Keep going.
and so there's a part of the speech where he's talking about Jews and Gentiles, Montagues and Capulets, everybody else coming together. That part was plagiarized from a man named Archibald Carey Jr., who was a Republican kind of orator. He gave a speech a couple years prior at a Republican convention where he said the same things, and Martin Luther King lifted that and used it in the "I Have a Dream" speech. Um, so why is it important to point out the fact that not only did he not write the speech, but it was written by people who subscribe to communist ideology, a communist worldview? Well, if you look at the "I Have a Dream" speech, it's appealing to symbols of the Constitution. It's appealing to religion. It's appealing to meritocracy. Meritocracy, namely this idea that he says in the speech, where I want for my children to be born or to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's meritocracy. Meritocracy is out of step with Marxism. So why would Marxists write a speech that invokes meritocracy? The reason for that is because communists are very good at using tools of deception, i.e., lying. They're utilitarians in that regard. A utilitarian is an individual who uses whatever tools at their disposal to get what they want, to get the effect that they want. Saul Alinsky was notorious for this. Um, they're not afraid to blend in and to act as kind of chameleons, just long enough to get what they want, to get into your good graces, and then move on to the next thing. This tactic is encapsulated or described, I should say, very well by Walter Lippmann, who wrote a book called Public Opinion in 1922. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, Walter Lippmann was a journalist, prominent journalist. In fact, not only was he a journalist, but he was an advisor to many presidents, including FDR. In 1922, he wrote a book called Public Opinion. And he says, when it comes to pushing a campaign that is unpopular to the general public, the very first thing a leader or a politician or a propagandist must do is to use rhetoric. And that rhetoric must appeal to symbols of patriotism, symbols of religion, or pentagrievance. And the idea being to get into the good graces of the public with that rhetoric, with your speeches, with the way that you articulate yourself. Once you have gotten into the good graces of the people, of the public will turn in toward you and they'll expect action. They'll expect a policy of campaign. That leader can then push a policy or campaign and people will go for it. Never mind the fact that that policy or campaign is disconnected from the rhetoric that you use in the beginning. And so when you look at the "I Have a Dream" speech, which evoked symbols of constitutionalism, of religion, of meritocracy. When you look
Right.
at that, that's out of step with what Martin Luther King was doing in the late 60s, which was pushing the I have a or the Poor People's Campaign. Now, what was the Poor People's Campaign? In his words, he said it was an effort to implement or to charge the government to implement a universal basic income, mass redistribution of wealth. A kind of, in his words, I'm not trying to put words in his mouth. He said this verbatim. You can go back and look it up, um, where he's talking about democratic socialism. These are the kind of things that he's talking about. And not only that, but people who were in his inner circle were interviewed, and they would say things like, and I put this on my IG just this morning, and I have the video where you can watch it and see for yourself, where he said, this is somebody who knew Martin Luther King. He said that Martin Luther King would talk about redistribution of wealth and his Marxism in private with his staff, but he never talked about it in public in his speeches for fear of this kind of anti-communism spirit that was alive and active at that time. And so here was a man, once again, who was pushing Marxism to the extent that he gave speeches that we can agree with. Um, that was done disingenuously and uh, deceptively, so as to get into the good graces of the American public and to be looked at as a hero. He was mythologized not only by his speechwriters, but also by the mainstream media. And this is the very last point I'll make before we move it on. Um, I think people should ask themselves, why is it that the mainstream media in the 1960s, which in many cases were atheists, when you look at the New York Times articles and Time Magazine articles all throughout the middle part of the 20th century, besmirching people like Billy Graham and other evangelicals. They did not like Christianity. They did not like religion in general. In fact, and then it was the 1960s where they took Bible reading out of the school. It became illegal to have Bibles in the school. That was in the 1960s. And it was also in the 1960s that they took prayer out of the school. And the media praised that. They applauded that. So why would that same media trip over themselves to praise and admire someone like a Martin Luther King, who's supposed to be a Christian pastor?
Right.
The reason for that, as the New York Times said, is here is the new Negro they called Martin Luther King, who's not like the old stubborn, stalemated Negroes of the South, the Christian Negroes of the South. Unlike them, Martin Luther King, he went and got educated in the North, and he brings a kind of intellectual dynamism to the stubborn Negroes of the South. And so Martin Luther King had a job, and that job was to do what the NAACP was unable to do before him under the behest of people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an atheist, and his ilk were atheists. They lived in New York, they operated in New York, and there was a disconnect between them and Negroes in the South. Martin Luther King was able to take that kind of Marxian message that the Northern elites were unable to take to the South. He was able to take it to the South because he came from among them, went and got educated in the North, and then brought it back to the South.
Wow. Interesting. So I just want to let people know the reason I brought on Chad today is because he's a wealth of knowledge about this stuff. Him, Justin Malone, and several others did the Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom 2 documentary. And I know him and Justin very well. They're friends of mine. And they spent years studying this stuff, going through archives, old articles. So he knows so much. One thing I want to bring up is Malcolm X. We never really learned about him in school, and he did not like Martin Luther King. From things that I've seen, he thought Martin Luther King was a puppet or a pawn and being used. And I heard a lot of Malcolm X speeches online that I never got taught in school, and I was like, wow, this guy was calling out liberals. He was calling out fake black leaders working for liberals. He has this one speech about Jews owning stuff, that I'm sure people,
Mm-hmm.
the Anti-Defamation League's not thrilled about, stuff like that, where I'm like, dang, this guy was definitely a straight shooter. And he said, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just speaking facts. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
ooh, that boy cold. I was like, that's crazy. So why do you think Malcolm X didn't like Martin Luther King, and why do you think they don't teach about Malcolm X the same way?
Malcolm X didn't like Martin Luther King because he knew full well that Martin Luther King was in bed with some very sinister people who sought to really take hold of Black thought and to use it for sinister means. And Martin Luther King was at the head of it. Um, it's no coincidence that Martin Luther King was with LBJ every step of the way when it came to pushing legislation that would, I mean, like, let's be real. All the 1964 or the Civil Rights Act of 1964 served to do was to expand the role of the federal government when it comes to small businesses, because what Jim Crow was Jim Crow was uh, it was state mandated, or in some cases county mandated segregation. That is the government telling you as a small business that you can only serve white people, or you can only serve Black people, or if you serve Black people, they can only come through this door. The government basically trying to mandate the ebbs and flows of the small business, which is unconstitutional. And so, really, what should have happened, what was actually happening in many cases without the involvement of the so-called civil rights movement, which is the repealing of those laws at the county and state level, and giving the private business owner back their rights, much the same as we witnessed just 2 years ago with a lot of counties and states trying to force mask wearing. Um, Here in Dallas County, for example, we had Judge Clay Jenkins, who tried to force small businesses to force their customers to wear masks upon entering a place of business. And if those small business owners didn't comply, they would be faced with a pretty hefty fine. A lot of people have it in their head, doesn't matter if they're, religious, non-religious, black, white, conservative, liberal, that Martin Luther King was a great man because he ended all of the so-called systemic racism. The reality is he didn't quite do that. All he managed to do was to assist in passing legislation that expanded the role of the federal government and usurped your rights as a private citizen and a private business owner. Malcolm X saw that and he understood that, and it's to that extent that he didn't pretty much care for Martin Luther King. You see a picture of Martin and Malcolm X standing next to each other, and they both seem to be smiling, but that was a photo op. It wasn't really genuine. It wasn't something where Malcolm X was looking forward to meeting Martin Luther King so he can take a picture next to him. I encourage people to look up the history of how that photo came into being.
I want to get into the policy of the like what actually happened, because it seems like a lot of Republicans know this, that after the MLK stuff, Democrats and maybe Republicans, I'm not really sure, you can expound on it, they passed all this legislation that really didn't make the country better. Like racial relations are not better, a lot of black statistics are not better. So I want to get into that. And a lot of Republicans, I think that like, oh, Martin Luther King was just used or something, or like maybe they did that after he was awesome and great, and then they did that after. Can you get into basically like what policy? Because I had a dream, like, oh, it sounds so amazing, like content, a character. Okay, this was a huge event that they pushed policy under. So, what happened after that speech, and what happened with the Civil Rights Act, and what happened to the country, the average black family? Like, how do you see that?
Yeah, so as Walter Lippmann laid out in his book Public Opinion in 1922, is Martin Luther King proceeded forthright legislation again that expanded the role of the federal government. If you look at any footage of Martin Luther King in terms of what he was advocating for, and specifically when he's speaking to crowds, when he's going among crowds and he's speaking to them, what is he saying? He's saying that we're going to take your issues, we're going to take your burdens, we're going to march down to Washington, and we're going to demand the federal government to act. And so he's putting our fate in the hands of the federal government. That's statism. That's socialism. That's what he was pushing for. That's a far cry from the likes of Booker T. Washington, who coined the term cast down your bucket where you are. In other words, it's on you. Be a man, be an entrepreneur, like be ambitious. Like nobody's going to give you anything. Nobody's going to give you a handout. So he put like Booker T. Washington put the onus on you. Martin Luther King came along and disrupted that, and he changed the rhetoric. He shifted the mindset of the black man in America. I argue that Martin Luther King moved us as black people. He moved us from a trying race to a crying race. He taught us how to cry. He taught us how to beg. He taught us how to act, to be activists and um, professional complainers. Before him, again, you had people like WEBD or like A. Philip Randolph. You knew them by their names, right? Because they were attached to a movement. What Martin Luther King did is he added the term or the word reverend, and he was able to do the same things that they were doing, except for now under the guise of reverend. And so after that, you had a lot of people come from, the cloth, people like Al Sharpton, Reverend Al Sharpton, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and a lot of lesser known individuals who boast the fact that they're reverend bona fides, they're pastoral bona fides, who use their pulpit once again to push this kind of statism, this kind of Marxism. They don't preach the gospel. In fact, for those among your viewers who are Christians, I think you'll find it interesting that myself, Professor Malone, writer Ansel, those of us at Malone Pictures, we went through every second of every minute of every hour of footage that exists of Martin Luther King Jr. And we found not one millisecond of him actually preaching the gospel, of him actually calling people to repentance. Not one. And not only that, we went over all of his sermons, all of the stuff that he wrote, all of his notes and things that he prepared for. Not even there did you find it, but you did find we're going to march down to Washington. We're going to demand a universal basic income. We're going to demand a redistribution of wealth. All this kind of World Economic Forum esque kind of talking points. You saw that in his, that was very loud and proud in his rhetoric, but not once did you see him actually preaching the gospel and calling people to repentance. And so, again, the only thing that we as so-called conservatives remember Martin Luther King for is a speech that he gave. We remember the man for what he said in a speech more so than what he actually did with his legs and with his hands and the organizations that he was a part of. We found check stubs of him getting paid from communist front groups that were backed by Soviet Union, Russia, that were made out to him, made out to his organization. And yes, he did claim that he wasn't a communist, but so too did Fidel Castro on his quest to power. Fidel Castro didn't even claim that he was communist until after he had already secured power in Cuba. Um, Denying that you're a communist is part and parcel of the communist tactics. You want to get into good people's good favor, and you don't do that by saying that you're a communist, by saying that you're a Marxist. You shield it, you hide it, you operate clandestinely to get into the good people's good graces, and you advocate for Marxist policies under a different name. That's the way that you do it. That's the way that you're effective. And
Right.
so yeah, the thing is, like, I would argue that the conservatism with which many conservatives have today, specifically Black conservatives, is a kind of tainted, a kind of soft, Care Bear type of conservatism, because of the existence of Martin Luther King's ideology, his Marxist ideology, on their own kind of worldview and the way of looking at the world. When you look